Hello, and welcome to Baha'i Blogcast, with me, your host, Rainn Wilson. This is where I interview members of the Baha'i Faith and other friends from all over the world about their hearts and minds and souls, their spiritual journeys, what they're interested in, and what makes them tick. Enjoy. Novin and Juliet, welcome to Baha'i Blogcast. So excited to have you on. It's such an interesting story that the two of you have, and your company, Oneworld Publications, is extraordinary. So I can't wait to begin this conversation.
Well, thank you for having us on. It's a pleasure to meet you virtually and to be part of the Baha'i blog.
Excellent, excellent. Well, let's start at the very beginning. How long have you guys been married?
Oh, gosh, that beginning. We got married in 1980.
1980, yeah.
Goodness gracious. So how did you meet?
We were both studying in the same library in the same University of Edinburgh. So we met quite regularly through the Baha'is used to organize regular activities, and I started attending them. So I'd just come back from Haifa, where I'd been, not from Haifa specifically, I'd been on a kibbutz in Israel and had come across the Baha'i Faith in Haifa through a friend of my father's. And so when I attended university, I joined the Baha'i Society and a few others. And so I started meeting the Baha'is and getting to know them quite well. And one of them happened to be Novin here. So we got to know each other through 3-4 years of university before we got married.
Oh, wonderful. But before we move on, what brought you to work on a kibbutz in Israel, and what was that like?
Well, I'd been at agricultural college, and I was quite keen to study farming in different climate and with different conditions. So I simply applied to go to a kibbutz, and I ended up near Eilat, in a very, very hot part of Israel, where they grew dates and melons and had a dairy. So it was a fascinating 6 months. And then from there, I went to university. But at university, I didn't study agriculture. I studied anthropology.
Were you just studying all of the A disciplines?
Yeah, I was going to do astronomy, but I thought anthropology sounded more interesting.
No archaeology?
Yeah, I'd also studied archaeology.
Yeah, you did. Okay, so you threw it all in.
Yeah,
Excellent,
yeah,
excellent.
Yeah.
Can I just add that before that, she used to work in a circus as well. So she's had a much more interesting life than I've had.
Not all A's, yeah. I worked in a circus for a year as well.
Okay, wait a second. You worked in a kibbutz and a circus? Okay, this is too much. What were you doing in the circus?
I was looking after the horses and helping with the clowns. As you do.
Was there like an ad in the paper of okay, we need someone to clean up the horse poop and also apply clown makeup? How did you fall into that?
Well, there was an ad in Horse and Hound, and at the time I was doing part-time work in restaurants in Sussex to earn the money to look after my horses. And I saw this ad and I thought, well, that sounds quite interesting. So my parents were slightly nervous about the idea that, as they said, I ran off to the circus, but it was really interesting. So I looked after the horses, which was something I knew, in a community that I was very interested to get to know. So it's sort of a sociological experiment for me, really, to understand a close-knit community like that and the hierarchies that exist in a circus, and the way the different acts, the family owners and the hired hands like me all fit together. It was really interesting.
And what prompted your initial interest in the Baha'i Faith? You're in a kibbutz in Israel. You come upon the Baha'i Holy Land, I assume, and start learning a little bit about it. What was your spiritual or religious background before that point, and which allowed you to be intrigued?
I was a member of the Church of England growing up, and I went to boarding school, which means you go to church every day and twice on Sundays. And after leaving school, I was a member of my local church, and my mother and I were probably the only two at the time in the family who were interested in Christianity, although obviously the whole family was, on paper Christian. But I think I kind of felt that I started to have questions that went beyond what we were being taught on Sundays, and began to sort of draw back a little bit. And then when I sort of put it aside, but when I went to university, I joined the Baha'i Society, the Methodist Society, and the Bible Study Society. So clearly I was interested in religion. But out of that, I was kind of kicked out of the Bible Study Society for really asking questions that I was discussing in the Baha'i sections of the sort of student life. And I think they found it a little disruptive because they were trying to study the Bible with a kind of a, what does Son of God mean? Read Matthew chapter this, verse that as the answer. And I was kind of saying, but what if you look at this? What if you look at that? And what is the afterlife of the soul? And all these kind of questions that were much broader than the way we were being taught. And I think they didn't really feel I was towing the line sufficiently. So they kind of encouraged me to look elsewhere for answers. And I found the Baha'i sessions, which were very kind of informal. It was sort of really a vegetarian lunch, and I was vegetarian at the time, so it was appealing to me primarily. And then they would often sort of have a separate session if you wanted voluntarily to go into another room, and they would give a little talk or they would discuss a principle. And to me, it allowed me the freedom to ask much deeper questions, and I just found it fascinating, to be honest. I found it intellectually very stimulating, and it made, as you find with a lot of people who first come across the faith, it made a lot of sense. You know, when you've lived in, say, a Jewish community, a Christian community, then you come across Baha'is. I also knew some Muslims at the time. And when you first come across the Baha'i principle that all religions are one and all people are one, and I was studying anthropology at the time, and studying a lot of primitive religions that, prehistorical religions and tribal religions, the Baha'i overarching concept that all people are equal and all religions are equal made absolute sense to me at the time. Nothing could have made more sense. So for me, it was a very easy step to say, well, yeah, I believe it all. And then I went to an event and somebody said, well, so how long have you been a Baha'i? And I go, well, I'm not a Baha'i. And they go, well, why not? And I thought, well, that's actually a good question. And it's a question we don't ask enough, I think, sometimes. And I sort of thought about it for a while. And then I thought, well, perhaps I am a Baha'i, and I believe there's nothing that I don't agree with. And so it was, for me, quite a simple process.
And was there a certain point of inspiration as well, visiting the Baha'i Holy Land in Israel? Was there some connection that was made there?
To be honest, I went there because one of my father's best friends, widow, was the deputy head of tourism in Haifa. And so I went up to stay with her a few times, and she took me there. And it was really recognizing the name in Freshers Week of the Baha'i stand that made it click. And it was so soon afterwards. I just felt it was kind of fated in a way that I felt I owed it myself to investigate further. You know, I didn't think I'd been given any information when I was in Haifa, but I later found a leaflet which I'd clearly picked up there. So I kind of felt like everything in my life had been leading in this sort of direction, that it had been broadening out, it had been deepening, and it made a lot of sense to me that I met the Baha'is so soon after having been to Haifa, and they were very excited to hear I'd just been to Haifa. To them, I think it made a lot of sense as well. But for me, the inspiration was more of the coincidence of it, and then finding so many of the ideas made so much sense to me, given my background, given my interests, given what I was studying. It just all made sense. So it was just a happy meeting of minds and souls, I think.
Oh, that's wonderful. And Novin, you came to the UK when you were young, kind of right before the Islamic Revolution. What was that like, and what precipitated your move?
Well, I'm the youngest in my family of four kids, and my father, who was a lawyer in the oil company, in the Iranian oil company in Abadan, which was a major, it was a city of a major oil refinery and oil, kind of Iranian oil scene. He retired, and my siblings were all in German-speaking countries. They were in Austria and Luxembourg, and they wanted to move somewhere English-speaking. So when he retired in 1971, they said, yes, Brighton in England was a nice city by the sea. So we just came to UK, and we ended up in Brighton. I was 15, I think, at the time.
And what was that like for a family of Iranian immigrants to Brighton, England in the 70s? I feel like that should be an independent film.
There were actually a surprisingly large number of Iranians in Brighton at the time and in London. For me, what was interesting was that in Austria, where my brothers studied, a lot of Iranians would basically come and never go back to Iran. They will settle down in Austria, marry, locals. And also many of them were highly politicized. They were involved in various anti-Shah movements in the early 1960s, mid-60s. In Austria, I think it was called the Student Federation movement. And I remember a lot of my brother's friends were active members of that. So once you start doing those things and you marry, an Austrian, then you kind of end up living there. But the ones who came to Britain typically came for a short period. They studied and then they went back to Iran. So it was a kind of a transient community. It was a kind of a culture shock, of course, as well, coming from, a more sociable environment of Iran coming to UK.
Especially the food.
Especially the food, yes. I remember a very nice Iranian family, one day when we showed up at their house in Brighton in the first few weeks when we arrived there, said to us, by the way, I need to point out to you that in this country, people don't just show up to other people's homes. They ring first, they arrange to go to someone's house, etc., etc. And I thought, oh my God, what kind of a country have we come to? That seemed like a really unfriendly thing. But yes, sort of cultural differences.
That's funny. I was just picturing, what would it be like if at any point in time someone could just knock on my door and show up and be like, hey, I was just in the neighborhood. And then I would need to welcome them in, cook for them, make tea for them. I mean, it sounds beautiful, but boy, it would make my head explode.
But in Iran, we did that, actually. And
in Cyprus.
Yeah, and, certainly in Iran, you go to someone's home. If they're not in, that's fine. If they're, if it's inconvenient even, you might go away or stay, a short period and go away. But it wasn't a big deal. And then, as Juliet says, we moved to Cyprus at some point for about 5 years. And it was the same there. Most people didn't have phones. So, you didn't actually have the option of calling them. You just showed up. And that was completely normal.
So Oneworld Publishing, and by the way, for people that are interested, it's oneworld-publications.com. But you founded that in 1986. Take me through, you're in a courtship in Edinburgh. It's 1980. You got married. What happened between the two of you in that marriage? Juliet, you're a new Baha'i before you found the publishing company.
Rightly or wrongly, we had 2 children. And it was very cold and windy in Scotland in the winter of 1982. And I kind of chucked in the towel and, hadn't long left university, found being isolated in a tiny village with 2 children quite tough. And we decided we'd move to Cyprus, where they needed Baha'is and particularly families. And so we literally drove to Cyprus. And Novin got a job.
Juliet, Cyprus is an island.
Oh yeah. So we drove to.
Drive to Cyprus.
We drove down through Europe to the bottom of Italy, took the boat to Greece, and from Greece took the boat to Cyprus. With two little children, aged 1 and 2.5. So it was an interesting experience. And Novin simply got a job as an accountant in Limassol, where we lived, and it was all very straightforward.
How long were you in Cyprus, and what was that like, pioneering in the 80s in Cyprus? This is also exotic for me. I'm sitting in suburban Los Angeles. I kind of want to know, give me the goods. This is exciting. Yeah. Circuses and kibbutzes and Cyprus. Come on.
Cyprus was amazing. I mean, for anyone brought up in Northern Europe, it's a fantastic island to live in. The community is, as Novin was saying, very sociable, and I think for us that was the part that we valued, that children are welcome everywhere. If you're invited to someone's house and you turn up without the children, they'll complain, as opposed to in England, where if you turn up with the children, they go, oh shoot, they brought the kids. So I think it was the community life we loved. We built a very strong community in Limassol. I think by the time we left, there were about 15 adults and about 20 kids or something. So it was quite a thriving community during the time we were there. and a lot of children, and it was, a very outdoor lifestyle, because even in the winter in Cyprus is pretty much like a British summer. And then the problem is the summer is very hot. In those days, no one had a phone and no one had aircon. So it was in that sense quite a challenge. But no, we loved it there. The problem we found was that surprisingly for 1983, almost all the women worked. And it meant that there were very few facilities for women with young children who weren't working and didn't want to put their kids into a nursery. And so I suppose I found it quite difficult being a parent of young children in that environment. And Novin wasn't particularly keen on accountancy, having studied it for the previous 5 years. So in the end, for some reason, we'd always had the idea of setting up a publishing company, potentially with a bookshop and event space attached, which never did materialize. And he handed
It's never too late.
Well, I totally agree with you that, and I'll take that as an endorsement of my passion when I next bring it up with Novin and he tries to beat it down. So we decided to set up a publishing company on a tourist island in the Mediterranean, which proved to have its own challenges, not least that the printers never thought they would get paid because they thought you were so far away you would run away with their money.
British printers, yeah.
British printers. Yeah. So we started from the point of not ever having worked in publishing, neither of us. And we set about literally learning whatever we could and finding printers, finding people who could help with the production, finding distribution. And then we had Oneworld. So it turned out to be relatively straightforward in the end.
So, was Oneworld founded in Cyprus then?
To be fair, it was. We actually registered it technically, I think in the autumn of 1984, but our first books came out in 1986. And by 1988, we found it too difficult to run a company which effectively had to be based in Britain from Cyprus. So we decided to move back, and we moved to Oxford in order to run it better.
So I come from the theater, and I have a lot of friends who started theater companies, and that is also an extremely difficult endeavor. I mean, you think about it, and it's like, how hard can it be? You find a space, you get some plays, get a bunch of actors together, sell some tickets. How hard could it be? But you have to have a vision for the company itself. You have to have that vision match with what the space is. How are you going to market it? There's a lot of plays out there. How are you going to entice audiences to come in? Then you've got the whole accounting thing. You've got grants and the nonprofit aspect of theater, trying to raise money, because theater can't be self-sufficient just from ticket sales. It goes on and on and on. You have a staff. You're running a staff. There's the technical aspects of theater. It's extremely complicated with a lot of different facets. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is, I've used the euphemism of my head exploding previously, but it kind of makes my head explode thinking about starting a publishing company. Wait a second. Okay, there's printers and binders and there's fonts and designing covers. And then how do you get them from there into a warehouse, and then you've got to get them out to stores, and there's distributors, and then you keep track of the money and international rights and contracts and legalities. There's so much stuff. Before we go into kind of the philosophical meat of what you do with Oneworld Publishing, how did you navigate this launch between 84 and 87?
Well, I think based on the few things you've just said, you know more about it than we did at the time. We really knew very little about publishing. But when we were at university, we used to spend a lot of time in bookshops and looking at books. And so, we were interested in the book industry. Juliet was a very dynamic officer in charge of book sales in the Baha'i community, and she was ordering books from all kinds of random countries that Baha'is had never heard of, and were selling their Baha'i publications to in the local community. And I think ended up making a lot of money for the Edinburgh Baha'i book sales. I got told off for making a profit. So we had an interest in the subject and in the industry, but yes, it's a kind of one of those embarrassing businesses to start for the first few years, you're going around with a very flimsy catalog. No one has heard of your authors. No one has ever seen your books in any bookshop. There's a long list. And until you have, a more regular number of titles that you publish every year and more, prominent authors, distributors aren't interested in carrying your books to bookshops, or representing your books to bookstores. So it's a kind of a chicken and egg situation. And, you basically, have to persevere for a few years before, things very gradually improve and you learn more about the business and you push the boat out very gradually.
It's certainly a lot easier to set up a publishing company today because you have internet, which we didn't have. And I think we still had telex when we started, if you can remember that. And then fax was just coming in. So I think with the internet today, you can jumpstart several years we spent learning the business. There are conferences you can go to learn, what publishing is all about. There are networking events. There are organizations set up to help small publishers in both America and Britain. You can go around to agents, literary agents, and explain to them what you're looking for. And we didn't, I'm sure there were agents around, but we certainly didn't know about them for many years. So we set up with the idea of trying to get academics to write for a general audience because it was an area of the market that wasn't very well developed. As I said, there was no internet, there was no Google. So in our experience, when you leave university, you often develop other interests in other subjects, but you no longer have a tutor, you no longer have access to libraries like university libraries, but you also don't want to get a very basic beginner's guide. So you want something a little bit more developed. And we felt that we can persuade academics to write for a general audience, which is even today not always that easy. They're not always able to write in a way that's accessible to a general audience and need a lot of editorial support. And some of them simply are not comfortable, particularly in the social sciences, writing for a broad audience. But that was what we wanted to do. And so we set up very much as a non-fiction publisher with the idea of making knowledge accessible and also to publish books that have a multi-faith angle as well. So those were our two main interests.
So let's just put a pin in that. So the philosophy behind Oneworld Publishing was taking nonfiction and making it accessible to a mass audience. This is before the internet. So, big ideas for a wider general audience, and at the same time having interfaith and multi-faith kind of texts available for a mass audience. Was there any other philosophical foundation to the launch of the publishing company?
I mean, that was pretty much it. But obviously, a lot of the people we have initially had access to were Baha'i academics. So we also did books on science and religion. We did books on spiritual parenting. We did sort of multi-faith collections of quotations and that kind of thing as well in the mix. But it wasn't ever supposed to be specifically a religious publishing company. We really wanted to, as you say, cover big ideas. But I suppose infused with the kind of values that we had ourselves in our own lives. That was really our main interest.
And for those, and I just want to put in a little plug for this publishing company. So here we are having this podcast about this obscure publishing company that's not very well known outside of the UK, but it just bears noting how incredible Oneworld is and how incredibly successful it is. It has here on their webpage, the New Statesman says, Oneworld has a remarkable track record of spotting novels that deserve wider attention outside their native lands. London Review of Books says, Oneworld punches above its considerable weight. So they had consecutive Booker Prize wins at Oneworld. So the Bookseller magazine says it would be impressive feat for, say, Penguin or Random House to notch up consecutive Booker wins. For an indie such as Oneworld, it's an astounding achievement. And the plaudits and laudits go on and on and on for this exceptional, used to be small, now is pretty robust publishing company. So I just wanted to, for the listener who might not know kind of what it is we're talking about an astonishing success in an independent publishing house. But go ahead, Novin, you wanted to address the philosophy that inspired the launch.
Sure. I mean, I think basically Juliet mentioned, certainly, Baha'i inspired publishing activity in the sense that, in the sense of Baha'i ideals, Baha'i values, concern with social issues, Certainly, dialogue among religions, adherence of religions, equality, all of these kind of things, which are kind of normal issues that Baha'is discuss, were our main areas of interest in publishing. And they still are in many ways. Also in our fiction list, that Juliet is responsible for all these bouquet winners that you mentioned. She looks for social and critical issues of our time that they reflect, and the diversity of lives and civilizations and cultural values. So
basically, long before the Universal House of Justice was asking us to have elevated conversations, you guys were inspiring elevated conversations.
Trying to.
Wonderful. So part of what Oneworld does is interfaith dialogue. And I know that you have a great number of Christian and Muslim academics and writers that are a part of the Oneworld family. So can you talk a little bit about developing that branch of the publishing house?
Sure. In the 1980s and 90s, the whole subject of interfaith dialogue had become very kind of current and topical. And especially several major Christian academics were involved in really pioneering work. People like John Hick, for example, a British philosopher who died recently. His ideas of the connection between world religions, and one of his famous metaphors was that instead of thinking that Jesus is at the center and all other religions are kind of revolve around it, that he introduced this Copernican revolution, that God was at the center and all other messengers or prophets or manifestations of God revolved around that center. So the idea that there are many paths to the same truth, etc., etc. These were works that mainly Christian academics and philosophers had pioneered. And this was obviously very much in tune with Baha'i ideas. And so we were very attracted to that. And another area which was also fascinating for us was, especially in the writings of Shoghi Effendi, but also in the talks of Abdul Baha, we come across this very often, the importance of Western Baha'is representing an accurate impression of Islam. In other words, that there is so much misunderstanding in the West about the message of Islam, the station of Muhammad, and the revelation. And Shoghi Effendi said this is one of the duties of the Baha'is in the West to correct this. And Abdul Baha, we know, went to churches and synagogues and talked about the truth of Muhammad, etc., etc. So it's impossible really to have a sufficient understanding of Baha'i revelation without understanding its parent religion, which is Islam, and the Islamic tradition. So one of the things that has been a focus for our list and still is books on Islamic studies. I mean, these are not proselytizing books. We don't publish proselytizing books either, on the Baha'i topics or other religions. These are books written by academics exploring interesting aspects of history or teachings or, lives of the founders. So, yes, Islamic studies has been a focus in our list, which it personally interests me greatly.
And I find even with some Iranian Baha'is that their knowledge of Islam is very limited or very skewed because they've suffered so much in Iran, or their family has, that quite often their kind of knowledge of like the Quran itself is quite limited. So that's interesting that Shoghi Effendi put this on Western Baha'i to kind of show fairly the Quran and the dispensation of Muhammad. What have you learned personally from all these interactions with these wonderful Islamic scholars at Oneworld?
Well, I mean, the point that, as you say, Shoghi Effendi really touched on very clearly is the extent of Islamophobia and misapprehensions about Islam, which he wanted the Baha'is to correct. And Islamophobia, a topic which has become extremely current now. I mean, it is literally inescapable in the West. In our media, in our culture, in our immigration policies, etc., etc. And it really is, certainly the way we see it, is an important duty for Baha'is to make sure that they are not, they don't get taken up by this this amazing frenzy of anti-Muslim sentiments that especially because of the Iranian Revolution. You will find Baha'is or members of other religious minorities, Jewish Iranian Jews, Iranian Christians, they mix their hatred, their dislike for the Iranian regime with Islam. It is understandable to some extent, of course.
Yeah.
But those who live in the West are also continuously exposed to limitless Islamophobia. So it really requires a very conscious effort to not get taken up by this and realize, in fact, the life and death impact of this. We see it even in the West. The way Muslims can get they get beaten up, they get picked on, they get bullied, etc., etc. So we come from a persecuted community ourselves in Iran. So we should be really aware of this and conscious of the impact of these views. These sentiments eventually do end up in actions, in violence against innocent people. And, you can't understand the Baha'i revelation, which is so much concerned with Islam, with the Imams, with its links to the Quran and, Rumi and et cetera, if you want to completely extract Islam and Islamic culture and civilization from Baha'i revelation, it's just simply not doable, no matter how much some Baha'is may like to do it. So appreciation of Islam is certainly critical for Baha'is. And you see that very much emphasized in Shoghi Effendi's writings and letters. Baha'i summer schools should have courses on Islam, He's not saying that the Baha'i Faith is a sect of Islam or is not an independent religion, but he says you have to understand that one.
In the same way that Christians generally study the Old Testament, it's the same sort of relationship.
Oh yeah, that's very well said, and I wish that had been part of my Baha'i education, because I grew up Baha'i. I was learning more about the Quran, but we never studied. I mean, I went to college knowing nothing about Muhammad, his history, the Quran, what was in it, what was actually said, the amazing mystical poetry of the Muslim dispensation, like Rumi, like you had mentioned, and other Sufi mystics. And that's too bad, because that would have been an amazing part of I'm having to kind of fill that in piecemeal as an adult.
Yes, and Baha'u'llah actually addresses this issue in the Kitab, Iran, in the Book of Certitude, where he says, don't judge a religion by its followers. I mean, he says this in these so many words. He says, and okay, we look around us and there are aspects of behavior of Muslim nations or some Muslim individuals that really we find reprehensible, absolutely. But Baha'u'llah's warning is there. He says, don't judge that religion just by those actions.
And then, oddly enough, the main success, it seems, of Oneworld is winning all these Booker prizes and the incredible home runs that you guys have hit in fiction. And you spoke before briefly about Juliet kind of finding these voices. Can you talk a little bit about this aspect of the imprint, Juliet?
So I read very widely in university translated fiction and fiction from all around the world. And we discussed a few times whether we should set up a fiction list, and we were a little nervous of getting into it because we had already been receiving numerous submissions from authors, which with novels, and we were able to say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, we don't publish fiction," and we were slightly reluctant to give that up. But I'd been reading novels, from authors set in Africa, in Afghanistan and around the world. And I kept saying to Novin, if we had a fiction list, that's exactly what I would like to publish. And it went on for a while. And eventually I thought, you know what, I'll start telling literary agents who we'd begun to get to know quite well that I would love to set up a list similar to the sort of list that I admire people like Farah Strass Giro or Knopf or Picador over here or Faber, and publishing companies that we admired for their literary fiction. And the first person practically I was talking to at the Frankfurt Book Fair said, "Oh, I think I've got something you might like." And it was a novel set in the 18th century on a slave plantation in Jamaica, written entirely in Pidgin English. And I started reading it and I went, wow, this is perfect. It doesn't sound perfect perhaps to a bookseller, but it sounded perfect to me. And it was by Marlon James. It was his second novel. And I bought it, and to everybody's surprise, most especially mine, we pitched it to a number of booksellers when we were near to publication, and they all seemed to get quite excited by it. And I thought, well, gosh, this sounds really difficult. Aren't they worried about readers finding it hard to read or what have you? And there's a chain of bookshops in airports here that's owned by W.H. Smith, and the fiction buyer at the time, Matt, said to the person representing us, I love this. I think this is fabulous. Let's put it in the bestseller list. And I kind of went, well, can they do that? Can he put it straight into a bestseller list? It's a novel by somebody not living in Britain. They were living at that point in Minnesota, Jamaican, quite difficult, slave plantation when slavery is just about to end. And I was very surprised. And then a few weeks later, they came back and said, oh, no, he's not going to put it in the bestseller list. I thought, oh, well, that's fine, of course. And he said, no, he's putting it in the time they used to have one shelf, which is the book everyone's reading this week. And I thought, oh, my God, that's so much pressure. But it did really well. And Matt was this fantastic supporter of the book, and he kept re-promoting it. He kept it in the bestseller list. So the very first novel we ever published, as I say, by a Jamaican who'd never been published in England before, it went on selling and selling and selling. And it gave us really a start. It gave us a little bit of confidence that perhaps my slightly wacky taste, maybe other people might like it as well. It didn't win. It won a Green Carnation Prize, which is not a huge prize. But it didn't win prizes, but it sold solidly. And of course, the next book he wrote, which I had an option on, went on to win the Booker Prize in 2015. So we were incredibly fortunate that had I not bought The Book of Night Women by Marlon James, I would not have had the opportunity to publish A Brief History of Seven Killings, which was his third book, which is the one that became an international bestseller.
Oh, that's such a beautiful story. That's really exciting. And I think about, and I've mentioned it before on this podcast, and I love that metaphor and the image that both Abdu'l-Baha and Shoghi Effendi weave throughout their writings, which is that the Baha'is are like the leaven. And I love this image of, you can't make a loaf of bread. It's just a hard, chunk of like wheat paste and water if you don't have this kind of impurity, if you don't have, I hate to say impurity, but this bacteria that allows it to rise, that allows it to elevate, again, elevated conversations, that leaven has things rise. And that's how I view Oneworld Publications, as, this leaven of moving the conversation forward decades at a time with voices that people weren't willing to take a chance on, and topics that people didn't think were publishable. That's so exciting. And so we hear a lot about the future of books, the future of publishing. People don't read books anymore. Is this true? Where is the world of publishing going?
I think certainly, I know when ebooks started a decade ago, people thought this would be the end of physical books. But in fact, physical books have been going from strength to strength. And I think the market is getting bigger. I think access to books online and in shops makes it very easy for people to buy books in whatever form they want to read or listen. So I think it's still a very important part of people's lifestyle. The number of people who come up to us and said, I just like the feel of a book. I like to take a book on holiday. I like to read in the evenings. And I think it's hard to imagine, especially with so much learning going online, it's hard to imagine that certainly the physical book won't endure endlessly. I can't see a time when it won't. But it's up to publishers to make books relevant, to be able to reach an audience, to develop that audience. I mean, in both Britain and America in particular, there's a great emphasis at the moment on diversity and inclusivity, quite rightly. And I think we've been very fortunate that our list is already incredibly diverse. We have books written by authors from probably over 50 countries. And I think this has given us an opportunity to be kind of at the heart of this developing interest, that we have authors from, this current season, we have authors from Singapore, from Vietnam, from Ghana, from Uganda, from Native American authors. We have a YA book coming out in the spring from a fantastic Ojibwe author. So we've been very fortunate to sort of because I think of our attitude as world citizens, we've been very fortunate to be slightly ahead of the curve. And it's placed us well. And I think as long as we keep publishing books that people want to read, I think the readership will be there.
That's wonderful. And what did you think of my book?
We were very surprised you didn't offer it to us.
And offended.
Wonderful,
Yeah.
wonderful awkward pause. Would you have taken The Bassoon King for British publication?
Well, it's a good question. I know it sold very well in America, though.
That's not true. It sold okay, but they gave me a big fat advance because I was a TV actor, and I don't think they made their advance back. So I think they're still licking their wounds over it. But people still enjoy it. Anyways,
It's very well
just
reviewed.
having a little fun with you.
I've read the reviews, and people say you have a fan base for sure for that book.
People enjoy it, and one thing I tried to do was I told the publisher, listen, it's going to be 3/4 funny stories and anecdotes and absurdity, and it's going to make people laugh. And there's going to be 1/4 of the book that is about my spiritual journey, and it's going to be about the Baha'i Faith, and it's going to talk about prayer and meditation and the search for God and life's big questions and stuff like that. So it's going to be both. I'm warning you. I'm just warning you. People may not be so keen for this, but they went for it. But that was my goal. Anyways, I don't know why we're talking about this. Well, we're talking about it because I'm a narcissist, and it always has to be about me. So, but I know that the future of publishing, we have way too many physical books. Our shelves are too full. We can't literally buy anymore. But I have my iPad, and I hear about books that I want to read, and I just, with a click of a button on my iTunes store, I have my iPad filled with books, and I'm unfortunately in this situation where I've read the first quarter or the first third of about 20 really interesting books, and then have very little follow through about actually finishing the book, which is too much. But I imagine that there's a lot of people like me that are actually buying more books electronically. It's a new way, because I don't like to carry a book around. I like to have the iPad, and then whatever I feel like, I want to read a religious book. Do I want to read a thriller? Do I want to read something inspiring? Do I want to read, something on, race and racial justice? I have all of those options right there on my little iPad. Yeah.
And audiobooks has become a big thing and is expanding very rapidly. I mean, initially, audiobooks or originally cassettes were seen as something that publishers produced in small numbers for the blind community, for the visually impaired, and now it's something people listen to in the car. They listen to it at night when they go to sleep. They listen to it on airplanes. So that has been a very lucrative area of publishing, and publishers are very even-handed. They're quite happy to sell a book in any format people want to read it. So we don't mind, as long as we get the money. We don't mind.
I sometimes go jogging and listen to books when I'm tired of podcasts, and I just want to be filled with information. In fact, I've been listening to Omid Safi, PhD, Memories of Muhammad.
Yes.
Why the Prophet Matters.
That's one of Novin's authors.
He's great. Omid Safi, Iranian-American, great guy. Yes. We published a book.
Oh, great.
We published a book by
I've been
him,
enjoying it a lot.
Yes. Absolutely. But we have a kind of a fairly prestigious series called Makers of the Muslim World, which was initially started as a series editor by Professor Patricia Krone, who is one of the most distinguished, or was one of the most famous historians of Islam at Princeton. And, we do small volumes on significant movers and shakers of the Muslim world. And there are about 40 books in that series now. And we're still publishing more.
Wonderful. So are there any favorite books that kind of sum up this cross-section of what you're trying to do with multicultural voices, interfaith voices and dialogues, kind of Baha'i-inspired storytelling and big ideas? Are there a handful that you'd recommend our listeners to dip into?
Sure. I'll mention a few nonfiction ones, perhaps. We've done a few Baha'i-related books. One of them is called The Baha'i Faith in Words and Images, written by Sina Fizel and John Dinesh. It's an illustrated book. It's a great introduction to the Baha'i Faith.
It's something that you can give to anybody. It's not proselytizing. It's information, but it's very accessible.
Another book that I think we feel kind of proud in publishing is by a very distinguished Israeli academic, Professor Ilan Pape, who, when we published the book, was a professor at Haifa University. It's called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. It's a very significant book on the relation between Israel and Palestine. Oh. It's a historical book. It's been a huge seller as well. And Ilan is a great academic in the field, and explains the history of the relation between the building of the State of Israel and the Palestinian community.
Which we felt was very important because I think certainly English people have a natural affinity with the underdog, and while many people might argue Palestinians are not the underdog, he's among many Israelis who are very concerned about the treatment of Palestinians. And this book, in a rather unsentimental way, goes through sort of decade by decade what has happened to them. And it's certainly a book that I cried editing. I think it was very moving, and I think it's the book I'm proudest of, to be honest, among the non-fiction books that I've published. But we have several editors now, and we have many books that we're enthusiastic about in the non-fiction side, haven't we, Novin?
Well, you talk about the fiction side.
Well, I mean, apart from the books that have won prizes like A Brief History of Seven Killings by Marlon James and The Sellout by Paul Beatty, which both won the Booker Prize, we published last year An American Marriage by Tayari Jones, which won the Women's Prize, which is the other big prize in the UK. And she really has produced a story that's very accessible. It's literary, but it's also very much the sort of book you can read at your neighborhood book club. But it really addresses, as does The Sellout actually, it really addresses a lot of the pernicious aspects of race in America, which I think fiction can be a very good vehicle for taking people into other people's lives and letting you walk in other people's shoes. And those two books, I think, for me, do that very well. They really show you what it's like to be black in America. And I think for me that's an important way to address issues in a softly approach, but obviously the story has to be very strong for them to work. You can't load up a novel with heavy ideas and expect it to sell. But those two have done a very good job of, I suppose, creating empathetic characters which allow you to go on that journey with them. And we've also published a book set in Singapore, How We Disappeared by Jing Lee, which again puts you in the position of the Singaporean villagers at the time of the Japanese invasion. In Britain, we tend to learn of the Far East side of the Second World War very much from the point of view of either the British soldiers or the expat communities that had to flee and often were sent off to camps. And I think it was the first time I've ever really looked at the situation from the point of view of the people who lived in Singapore, the Singaporeans. So those to me are among many books where we've tried to find stories that broaden our understanding of the world and its history and often its ongoing problems in a way that people can identify with the characters. And it's it conveys a type of truth which is still valid, but obviously it's through the imagination of the novelist, but they still convey a truth that is real and pertinent and that helps people to become more empathetic. And actually literary fiction is one of the primary ways they think that people do develop empathy, which is why it's quite worrying that men don't read much fiction, in my opinion. Just saying that because it's actually a study.
Yes, well, you've actually hit a nerve because I used to read a lot of fiction. My wife is a fiction writer, actually published and well-regarded short story writer who went to Iowa Writers Workshop and whatnot. But I used to read a lot of fiction, and I don't know what it is, but I'm just much more interested in the world of ideas. And
but fiction is also a world of ideas. That's the mistake. It's not considered manly, and maybe you're suffering from that idea.
I love that you're sticking it to the men about fiction, but that it's so important. This, this is one of the major breakdowns of Western civilization is the lack of compassion and lack of empathy.
On the part of men, you're saying?
You see it everywhere.
On the part of men, you mean?
So now, what about Baha'is? So, two questions. What kind of books would you like to see more from Baha'is and about the Baha'i faith in the marketplace? And what advice do you have for aspiring Baha'i writers?
Well, again, if you're talking nonfiction or fiction, I mean, I think spiritual fiction probably can be fantastic, but it's so difficult to pull off. Not many people can get away with books like Siddhartha or Jonathan Livingston Seagull and books like that
Sure.
that we used to read when we were much younger. But those kind of books, I mean, those would be amazing, and they are moving, and they make us reflect. So yeah, I'm sure that phase will come. You know how publishing goes through these fads and phases, and that phase may well come back. I'm hoping it will. But in terms of nonfiction, well, it's difficult. But Baha'is don't generally find it very easy to write in a way which is not proselytizing, but is kind of measured and reflects their expertise in the subject. So I think that is the main challenge for Baha'is. I mean, when we set up Oneworld, we were very keen to publish more Baha'i books, but we soon found that...
Well, books written by Baha'is.
Yes, yeah. Books written by Baha'is, presenting Baha'i perspectives. But
softly.
Yeah, exactly. But you need to, they need to first be experts within a field and be able to correlate that field with Baha'i principles and kind of framework. And that is a very difficult thing to achieve. And we soon found that, there aren't many people who can do it. So...
We certainly have very few Baha'i authors, to be fair.
Yes, we do. As a result, we have much fewer Baha'i authors than we would ideally like. But
oh, great! So you hear that, listeners? They're taking solicitations for all of those Baha'i authors, for all of those.
You said you would cut that out, right?
Damn.
But one thing I want to say, because you've mentioned a couple of times without proselytizing, and obviously we're forbidden to proselytize, and no one wants a hard sell, and no one wants to, quote unquote, attempt to be converted. But at the same time, I've noticed in this era in the United States, in the last 3 to 5 years, the appetite for kind of alternative spiritual paths and spiritual solutions to the kind of ravenous disunity that's happening across the globe is enormous. And people, just over the last really 3 or 4 years, are so hungry to learn more and to get more Baha'i perspectives. And they're spiritually curious in ways that they weren't, 7 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So I think a lot of Baha'is that I interact with who have maybe, maybe kind of given up on teaching or have a hard time teaching or don't want to teach for fear of appearing proselytizing. There's an appetite there that is new and fresh. And I think it's because of everything going on, especially in the United States and the United Kingdom, politically, and the fierce divisions between people that have been created. So it's a different environment, wouldn't you say?
I agree with you. I mean, Juliet, you used to really enjoy those biographies of some of the Western Baha'is.
Yeah, very inspiring.
Which ones were they? They were...
From Copper to Gold.
From Copper to Gold, that's right. That was about the life of Juliet Thompson. So, I mean, there is a way to write fantastic text that can be infused with, someone's inspiring life. But,
I think
it's difficult.
It is difficult. And I think... From my own experience, I think one of the things that Baha'is can offer the world, as can others, but is to learn to love and respect everybody. And I don't think that's so much at the heart of our faith and at the heart of spirituality, that you need to respect yourself, you need to respect the people around you, you need to, your life should be an act of service. I think that's something that we can if we can communicate it in, person to person is often the easiest way, but in the way we live our lives, I'm trying to think how one can communicate that in a book itself, because to me that is the thing that is almost the antibody to what the world is going through right now. And I think that if one can convey that somehow, we have in the past put together collections of quotations from different religions as a way to create a sort of those values that really are the core of a Baha'i life, or a spiritual life effectively, and in a way that is not sort of specifically proselytizing, but is a way that people can read it in, not feel pressured. And we produced quite a few on prayer, on death, on how to live a life, and I think that was our attempt at the time to try to get across those values. And I'm not sure how one could do it today.
It's difficult, but I certainly agree with you that there is an appetite. And I also think actually science and technology, and as well as books have made it a lot easier for us to be able to imagine these things. For me, for example, films like Matrix, or the fact that I have absolutely no problem in thinking that I back up my phone on the cloud, every second of the day, and to me that is kind of a great metaphor for the way, human soul is backed up in something like a cloud. It's to me that makes it more imaginable, more possible that when we talk about immortality, etc. Well, my mind and whatever is my personality is backed up somewhere in some form of a cloud. After all, my brain is full of electrical activities. So why is it that I'm comfortable thinking that my phone in some mysterious way is backed up somewhere? But I can't imagine that my personality or my soul has some immaterial presence somewhere, So...
So science fiction might be the path in, because I love science fiction in terms of its metaphorical power around spiritual ideas. This is some of what you're referencing right now.
Exactly. Matrix, amazing film. It's full of spiritual analogies.
Within publishing, science fiction is considered a genre, and I think for people who are involved in literary fiction, it tends to be regarded as an inferior genre, like romance fiction or historical fiction. But in actual fact, science fiction often conveys ideas and possibilities and truths about our current life that can be transformative. So I think I've got a newfound respect for science fiction that perhaps I didn't have when I started my fiction list. And dystopian fiction as well, I think can carry a lot of ideas about who we are as human beings and our place in the universe. So I think maybe there's some way to do that in fiction as well.
So do you hear that, listeners? We're looking for the next great Baha'i science fiction writer. Send all your manuscripts to Oneworld Publications.
Care of R. Wilson.
1313 Lux Street. Listen, do you have a Baha'i quote or a prayer, or is there something you've read recently in a Baha'i book or in the Baha'i writings that inspires you, motivates you, you find fascinating, that excites you? I'd love to turn it a little bit more to the faith and see what is exciting you spiritually, or what you've been pondering recently.
I wouldn't say a specific quote as such, but we are working on a book on the Bab, on the life of the Bab, the Baha'i, his teachings, his life, his writings. And it's, the Bab is such an amazing, fascinating personality. Each time I read something about him or by him, I realize how little the Baha'i community knows about his life and, his personality. He seems to have been a much more approachable, kind of sweeter kind of, personality than, for example, when we read about the majesty of Baha'u'llah, as the way the early believers would approach him or talk to him or respond to him. The Bab seems to have been a much more kind of a normal person.
Man of the people.
Yeah, people would take their wife to the prison and talk to him, and it's a fascinating thing, and his revolutionary mind. And in fact, there is a greater. I mean, even in Iran, in the last few years, there have been several books written about the impact of Babis in the Iranian kind of society in terms of political movements, etc., etc. He really released something, and the early Babis were kind of infused with some enthusiasm for changing the social situation of the country, which I think is also what attracted Edward Brown, for example, the Cambridge guy. He saw the Baha'is and thought, gosh, they're a little boring. But the Bab and his kind of revolutionary impact, he thought was, wow, that's going to revolutionize Iranian society. So the 200th anniversary that we had recently for the Bab is something which has rekindled, I think, interest in his life. And we're publishing a book very short in the next couple of months, which has contributions from many prominent academics in the field.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Juliet, what about you? Something you've been thinking about, reading about, praying about, meditating about from the Baha'i Faith, or writings that you want to share?
I think, I'm getting old. Coming up to my 65th birthday. And I think
that's nonsense. You are a young flower. You're a young British flower.
And I think age or maturity, I think brings to mind very much how we live our life and what we achieve in our life. And it's not about winning prizes or making money. I think very much about the principle of bringing yourself to account every day and applying that to your whole life, because obviously at some point we're answerable for what we've done with the opportunities and advantages that we've had in life. And to me, I think, is publishing enough? Are there other things that we could have done with our lives or should do with our lives? And I think this is something we all need to think about, that we need to think about how we lead a good life, what we leave behind, how we help. And I think we should think about that on a regular basis and think, what more can we do? And because to me, I think that's, I'm getting near to the point where I'm going to have to answer for what I've done in my life or what I haven't done with my life. And I think, not in a negative sense, but I think it's important for us to bear that in mind, to bear in mind that many of us have been given so many advantages, so many opportunities, and we need to see how best we can use those for the benefit of other people. So for me, I think that's something I'm thinking about a lot.
Oh, that's beautiful. And, Abdu'l-Baha talks about that, about, meditating on the end of life as a motivation to inspire one's daily life. And certainly that, Native Americans did that, indigenous traditions, many traditions throughout the world about, the Stoics did it, meditating on the possible end of life, and each day is a precious gift. Well, this conversation has been really stimulating. This is really exciting. So many people are going to be just thrilled to hear about your company and what you've done. And thank you for all of the amazing work that you've done, all the ideas that you've brought to the world, all the great stories that you've been a part of and helped tell. So thank you so much, Novin and Juliet, and thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting us. It's been a real pleasure.
Very good to chat with you. After all these years, hearing your name and watching you on TV.
Thanks. Thanks for listening to Baha'i Blogcast. Hope you enjoyed the episode and the conversation. Check out more fun Baha'i stuff on Baha'iBlog.net. Thank you so much, and good night.